It was supposed to be the happiest day of his young life, the moment a black teenager, grinning ear to ear, pedaled through his own neighborhood on the gleaming $10,000 mountain bike his father had surprised him with for his birthday, a gift so rare and so perfect that it made him feel unstoppable. But within minutes, that joy twisted into humiliation. When a pair of HOA members standing at the corner, their eyes narrowed with suspicion, began whispering to one another, pointing at him, muttering that there was no way a kid like that could afford a bike like this, their voices dripping with disdain. And instead of celebrating a neighbor's success, they chose to call the police, reporting him as a thief in his own community. Sirens wailed in the distance, and what started as a proud ride soon became a nightmare as squad cars pulled up and officers jumped out, blocking his path, their hands resting on their holsters as though the boy on a bike was a dangerous criminal. The neighbors gathered, some watching with pity but too afraid to speak, while others, the same HOA members who had made the call, folded their arms smugly, waiting for the boy to be dragged away in shame. The officers barked questions, demanding proof of ownership, sneering when he stammered that it was a gift, their voices growing harsher as they accused him of lying, telling him to get off the bike, patting him down in front of everyone, as if his skin color was a crime. His heart raced, his face burned with embarrassment, and the expensive bike that had once made him feel proud now felt like evidence in a case built only on racism. The tension thickened as one officer reached for the bike, muttering that it would be impounded, while the boy's protests went ignored, and just when it seemed the humiliation would break him completely, a powerful voice rang out from across the street, a voice that stopped both the officers and the HOA members cold. It was his father, a man who had worked tirelessly to build a life of dignity and success. Walking swiftly toward the chaos, his presence commanding and undeniable. The crowd turned, whispers rippling through them as recognition spread, because this wasn't just any father. This was one of the wealthiest homeowners in the neighborhood, a respected man who had given back to the very community now trying to tear down his son. He carried a folder in his hand, receipts, paperwork, undeniable proof that not only was the bike purchased legitimately, but it was bought with love, a symbol of pride for a son who deserved to ride it without fear. The look on the officers' faces shifted from arrogance to unease, and the HOA members' smug smiles faltered as the father's voice rose, calm but cutting, demanding to know why his child had been harassed in front of neighbors and friends. Why the assumption was always guilt instead of innocence when the skin was black. The silence that followed was heavier than the sirens had been. The boy, still trembling, watched as his father defended him with unshakable resolve. And though the humiliation could never be erased, the lesson was clear. This was more than just a bike. More than just a ride. This was about dignity, justice, and exposing the racism lurking in plain sight within the very community they called home. The teenager's name was Marcus, a 16-year-old honor student with dreams bigger than the quiet, manicured neighborhood his family had worked so hard to move into. A place lined with identical homes, freshly trimmed lawns, and smiling faces that masked an undercurrent of hostility he had begun to notice more and more as he grew older. His parents had always told him that life here would open doors for him, better schools, safer streets, brighter opportunities, but even as he peddled his brand new birthday gift through the neighborhood, the reality was far more complicated. Because in a community governed by a powerful and self-righteous HOA, the unspoken rule was clear. Families like his were tolerated, but never truly welcomed. The bike itself, a gleaming $10,000 masterpiece his father had proudly unveiled in their driveway that morning, represented more than just a present. It was a symbol of years of sacrifice, late nights, and endless determination, a promise to his son that he deserved the very best, despite the whispers of those who thought otherwise. Marcus had been overjoyed, testing its polished gears and smooth tires, the sun catching its chrome details as he zipped down the street, waving to neighbors, who responded with half-hearted nods, their smiles forced, their eyes full of quiet judgment. For a few fleeting minutes, he felt invincible. The wind in his face, The freedom of speed, the pride of knowing his father believed in him so deeply. But as he rode past the HOA clubhouse, the place where neighborhood disputes were settled, and rules enforced with ruthless precision, he felt the stares of two board members, Mr. Collins and Mrs. Hargrove, their eyes following him like shadows. Collins, a man known for filing complaints over lawn heights and parking spaces, muttered under his breath to Hargrove, shaking his head in disapproval. They watched Marcus ride by, as though he were an intruder instead of a neighbor, whispering their suspicions, convinced no black teenager could possibly own such an expensive bike legitimately. It was the kind of scrutiny Marcus had endured before: side glances at the pool, muttered comments at block parties. The constant reminder that no matter how much his family contributed, they would always be seen as outsiders. But this time, the whispers carried weight, because Collins pulled out his phone, dialing the police with a chilling calmness, describing Marcus not as a boy enjoying his birthday, but as a suspicious thief racing through the neighborhood. Inside his home, Marcus's father, David, had been on a business call when he noticed the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off his office window, a sight that made his stomach drop. He knew instantly something was wrong, because in their experience, police rarely arrived in their neighborhood unless someone, usually the HOA, had escalated a complaint. Outside, Marcus was already surrounded, his joy gone, replaced by fear and confusion as officers barked orders at him, demanding his name, demanding to know where he had gotten the bike, demanding answers he gave, but they refused to believe. Neighbors gathered at the edges of their driveways, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others looking on silently, afraid to intervene. The HOA members who had made the call stood proudly, arms crossed, their eyes gleaming with satisfaction, as if their plan to put Marcus in his place was unfolding perfectly. The officers grew harsher, telling Marcus to step off the bike, warning him that lying would only make things worse. One even reaching toward his holster, as though this harmless teen on his birthday was a threat to public safety. Marcus's hands trembled as he tried to explain, his voice cracking as he said over and over that the bike was his, a gift from his father, a celebration of the person he was becoming. But the disbelief in their eyes was absolute, and each time he spoke, the accusations grew louder. Inside, David ended his call abruptly and rushed out the front door, his heart pounding with both fear and fury. Because this wasn't just another misunderstanding. This was the culmination of years of quiet prejudice, a moment where his son's dignity was being stripped away in front of the very neighbors who had never accepted them. As he walked quickly toward the gathering crowd, his mind raced with questions. How dare they humiliate his child? How dare they call into question what he had worked so hard to provide? How dare they treat his son as a criminal simply because of the color of his skin? And with each step, his determination grew stronger, because David was not just a father, he was a man of influence, a man with power and respect, a man who knew that the truth was on his side, and this time, he would not let the HOA or the police walk away without being held accountable. The air grew heavier by the second as Marcus stood frozen, his knuckles white against the handlebars of his prized birthday gift, his heart thundering in his chest while the officers loomed closer, their questions sharpening into accusations, their eyes narrowing with suspicion instead of compassion. And with each passing second, the crowd of neighbors thickened along the sidewalks, whispers rippling like wildfire, some shaking their heads in quiet dismay, others grinning with satisfaction at the humiliation unfolding before them. The HOA board members, Collins and Hargrove, exchanged smug glances, their arms folded tightly across their chests as if they were overseeing justice being served rather than orchestrating cruelty, their voices carrying over the murmurs as they loudly repeated their claim that Marcus had stolen the bike, feeding the officers' lies with the confidence of people who knew their word would be taken more seriously than a black teenager's truth. Marcus, his voice cracking with desperation, tried once more to explain, stammering that it was his birthday, that his father had surprised him with the bike that morning, that the receipts and proof were inside the very house he stood only feet away from, but his words seemed to evaporate in the thick, tense air. swallowed by the officers' refusal to listen, their hands twitching near their holsters, their body language screaming hostility rather than protection. One officer sneered, demanding Marcus dismount, gripping the bike frame as if preparing to wrestle it away, while the other pulled out a notepad, jotting down false details provided by Collins, twisting the truth into something grotesque. The sight made Marcus's stomach twist, because he knew that in their eyes, he wasn't a child celebrating a birthday. He was already guilty, already condemned by skin color alone. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes as laughter erupted from a small group of neighborhood teens watching from across the street, their voices mocking him, repeating the officer's words like cruel echoes. "Yeah, where'd you steal it from?" Each word cutting deeper than the last, each laugh reminding him that he was being stripped of dignity in front of his entire community. Just when he thought he might collapse under the weight of it all, his father David's voice thundered across the pavement, commanding silence as he strode into the circle of officers, his tall frame radiating authority and unshakable anger, his sharp suit and calm but fiery expression drawing every eye in the crowd. David's presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. The neighbors whispering louder now, some recognizing him as one of the most successful homeowners in the neighborhood, a man who had donated generously to local schools, helped fund community projects, and whose influence reached far beyond the manicured lawns of the HOA. Yet here he was, forced to defend his son's right to simply exist in his own neighborhood, with one hand gripping a leather folder packed with receipts, warranties, and photographs from that very morning. David positioned himself between Marcus and the officers, his voice measured but dripping with controlled fury as he demanded to know why his child was being treated like a criminal. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado faltering under the intensity of his words, but Collins stepped forward smugly, insisting they had done the right thing, that someone like him could never have afforded a bike like that, a comment that sent a wave of gasps through the crowd and solidified what everyone had known but few dared to admit aloud. This was not about theft. This was about race, about a system of power that saw black success as something to be questioned, not celebrated. David's jaw tightened as he raised the folder high, flipping it open with deliberate precision, pulling out the official receipt stamped and signed by the luxury bike store, holding up photographs of Marcus beaming that very morning beside his gift, the kind of evidence so undeniable that it left the officers scrambling, their authority unraveling in real time as the crowd pressed closer, cell phones raised, recording every moment of the confrontation. David's voice grew louder, his words carrying the weight of years of prejudice endured in silence, as he condemned not only the police for their reckless profiling, but also the HOA board members for weaponizing their authority to humiliate a child. His speech cracked through the tension like a whip, igniting murmurs of support from previously silent neighbors who had watched in shame as the injustice unfolded. The officers, now visibly rattled, muttered apologies, their earlier aggression replaced by nervous glances at the crowd. But David did not stop there. He leaned closer, his voice low but lethal, warning that this humiliation would not disappear quietly, that their names, their actions, and their failure to protect instead of persecute would be exposed for the entire city to see. Marcus, still trembling but standing taller now, looked at his father with a mix of awe and relief, realizing that what had begun as the worst birthday of his life might transform into a defining moment, one where the truth could no longer be buried under lies, one where justice would finally push back against the weight of racism in the very heart of the neighborhood they called home. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as David stepped forward, no longer a father merely defending his son but a force of reckoning, his words slicing through the tense air with a clarity that left no room for denial, his voice rising with each sentence as he laid bare the ugliness of what had just unfolded, a boy humiliated on his birthday, a child treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood, all because of the color of his skin and the smug whispers of an HOA that had always made their family feel like outsiders. The officers shifted nervously, their earlier aggression collapsing under the weight of undeniable truth as David brandished the receipt. The store manager's signature shining beneath the fluorescent ink, then thrust forward photographs of Marcus taken that very morning, his smile wide, his joy pure. Standing beside the bike that had been meant as a symbol of love and pride, not a weapon to be turned against him. The neighbors, many of whom had once stood silently by, as prejudice festered behind white fences and manicured lawns, now found themselves confronted with a truth so stark it could not be ignored, and phones were raised higher, recording every detail, broadcasting the scene to the world beyond this cul-de-sac of lies. Collins, still desperate to cling to authority, barked out a protest, insisting that they had only been protecting the neighborhood, but David wheeled on him, his eyes blazing, his finger stabbing the air as he recited, with damning precision, a list of the HOA's past slights and grievances against his family, the fines for imaginary violations, the complaints about his wife's garden, the stares at block parties, and now, the false accusation that had nearly cost his son his dignity, and possibly even his freedom. His words were not shouted, but thundered with conviction, each syllable echoing through the stunned crowd as he declared that enough was enough, that the time for silence had ended, and that the world would know what had happened here. The officers tried to retreat, muttering apologies and attempting to downplay their role. But David blocked their path, his presence unmovable, his demand for accountability ringing out like a verdict. They would file a formal apology. They would include the truth in their reports, and if they thought they could walk away quietly, they were gravely mistaken, because he was prepared to take this to the highest levels of the city, the courts, and the media. The neighbors, emboldened now, began murmuring their support, voices rising against the injustice, some even shouting that they had seen everything, that the boy had done nothing wrong, that the house call had been laced with prejudice from the very start. Marcus, still gripping the handlebars of his bike, felt his chest swell with a mixture of relief and awe as he watched his father dismantle the lies piece by piece. His humiliation transformed into vindication with every word spoken on his behalf, and for the first time that day, he lifted his chin, refusing to let the shame stick to him any longer. The moment reached its breaking point when David turned to the crowd, his voice booming as he demanded they decide what kind of community they wanted to be, one where lies and racism thrived behind smiling faces, or one where truth and dignity stood unshaken. His words struck like lightning, igniting applause from those who had once stayed silent, their cheers echoing down the street as Collins's smugness finally cracked. His face pale, his authority shattered before the very people he had sought to impress. The officers, visibly cornered, finally admitted they had made a mistake. Their apologies hollow but public, captured on dozens of phones that would soon ensure their shame reached far beyond this street. And though it did not erase the harm, it marked a turning point, a moment when the balance of power shifted. Marcus, trembling but stronger now, looked at his father with a new sense of pride, realizing that this was not just about him or his bike, but about every child who had ever been judged unfairly, every family who had ever been forced to prove their worth in the face of prejudice. The climax crashed over the neighborhood like a storm, leaving Collins exposed, the officers disgraced, and the truth undeniable. The boy they had tried to break stood taller than ever, his father at his side, and the world watching. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, the echoes of David's words still hung in the air like thunder after a storm, a reminder that something profound had just shifted in the heart of a neighborhood long poisoned by quiet prejudice and the heavy hand of an HOA that had hidden behind bylaws and authority for too long. Marcus remained standing beside his bike, no longer trembling, his father's arm draped protectively yet proudly across his shoulders. And though his heart still carried the sting of humiliation, it was now layered with something stronger: pride, resilience, and the realization that the truth could not be silenced when courage spoke loudly enough. The officers, their apologies ringing hollow, retreated under the weight of countless recording phones and sharp glares from neighbors who had witnessed their bias exposed in real time, knowing their names would soon circulate far beyond the one sack. Their actions immortalized as yet another example of racial profiling in a world that was no longer willing to look away. Collins and Hargrove, stripped of their smug confidence, found themselves the subject of angry whispers. Their once tight grip on the HOA already slipping as homeowners muttered about meetings, votes, and accountability, the seeds of change planted firmly in the fertile ground of outrage and shame. For David, the moment was not about revenge, but about reclamation, reclaiming his son's dignity, reclaiming his family's rightful place in a community they had invested in, and reclaiming the narrative from those who had tried to define them by suspicion instead of respect. That evening, as Marcus wheeled his bike back into the garage, his father knelt beside him, not with anger in his eyes but with fierce tenderness, reminding his son that the incident, as painful as it had been, was not a reflection of his worth, but of the prejudice that still lived in others, and that by standing tall, by refusing to be broken, they had turned humiliation into a lesson for everyone watching. Over the following days, the story spread far beyond the neighborhood. Videos uploaded online gained thousands of views, then millions, sparking debates on local news and igniting conversations in living rooms across the country about racial profiling, about the subtle and overt ways bias infiltrated everyday life, about how easily innocence could be twisted into guilt when skin color became the deciding factor. Messages of support poured in from strangers who had seen the footage, praising David's courage and Marcus's composure, calling them symbols of strength in a time when silence was no longer an option. The HOA board, once untouchable, faced petitions and demands for resignations. Their authority fractured as neighbors who had once cowered under their scrutiny now found their voices, emboldened by the example set before them. And yet, for all the external impact, the truest resolution came in the quiet moments. Marcus, riding his bike again, not with fear but with defiance, his head high as he pedaled past the same corners where he had once been stopped, his presence, a statement that he would not be chased out of the joy he had earned. His father, watching from the porch, knew the scars of that day would not disappear easily. But he also knew that his son had gained something priceless. The understanding that dignity is not granted by others but claimed from within, and that injustice, when confronted, can be turned into a catalyst for change. The impact rippled far beyond the family, reshaping the neighborhood itself, where once silence had been the norm. Now conversations about equality, fairness, and respect echoed at meetings and block parties. A community forced to reckon with the ugliness it had allowed to fester and the responsibility it bore to do better. For David and Marcus, the resolution was never about punishment alone, but about awakening neighbors, awakening institutions, awakening the world to the truth that racism, whether whispered in HOA meetings or shouted through police commands, could no longer stand unchallenged. And though the bike gleamed in the garage, polished and ready for the next ride, its true value had transcended its price tag. It had become a symbol of resilience, of justice, of a father's love and a son's courage, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not in courts or offices but on quiet streets, where dignity is tested and truth demands to be heard. As the officers backed away and the smug HOA members realized their lies had crumbled, the cul-de-sac fell into a heavy silence, one broken only by the quiet sound of Marcus climbing back onto his bike. The boy who had been humiliated moments earlier now rode with his head high, his father's proud gaze following him, as if to remind the world that no amount of suspicion or hate could strip away their dignity. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now spoke in low tones about change, petitions, and accountability, because the mask of normalcy in the neighborhood had been ripped away. The video of the incident spread far beyond the community, forcing people everywhere to confront the painful truth of how easily innocence could be criminalized when skin color became the only evidence. For Marcus, the scars of that day would linger, but so would something stronger, the knowledge that he was not broken, and that his family's strength had turned humiliation into resistance. The bike, once just a birthday gift, became a symbol, a reminder that freedom must be claimed, even in the face of injustice, and that silence is never protection. And so the story ends, not in defeat, but in reckoning, a father's courage, a son's resilience, and a neighborhood forced to confront its own prejudice. Because in the end, the question remains, how many more moments like this must happen before society finally says enough, as the officers retreated and the HOA members realized their lies had collapsed? Silence swept over the cul-de-sac. Marcus stood tall beside his bike, his father's arm firm on his shoulder, no longer a victim of humiliation but a symbol of resilience. What began as an act of prejudice had backfired, exposing the Habs' bias and the officers' profiling to a neighborhood, and soon, to the world. The video spread quickly, igniting conversations far beyond the quiet streets, forcing people everywhere to confront how easily innocence could be twisted into guilt when skin color became the deciding factor. For Marcus, the sting of that day would not vanish overnight, but he carried something far stronger than pain: the knowledge that he had not been broken. His bike, once just a birthday gift, now stood as a symbol of defiance, proof that freedom and dignity cannot be taken when courage fights back. His father's stand turned humiliation into resistance and silence into reckoning. The HOA's grip began to crack, neighbors demanded accountability, and what was meant to shame one family instead awakened an entire community.